All right, welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Every now and then we get a chance to dig into one of those truly epic moments in history. And today, we're doing just that. We're going to be unpacking the story of Sultan Muhammad Fateh and how he managed to conquer Constantinople. This was back in 1453. And we've got some amazing source material here that really paints a picture of how this young ruler, facing what seemed like impossible odds, really changed the course of history.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that you almost can't believe happened, right?
Right.
I mean, we're talking mid-15th century here. Constantinople was still this incredibly important city at the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a continuation of the Roman legacy, and it controlled these super important trade routes. I mean, just imagine you're a 19-year-old sultan, you just stepped onto the throne, and the first thing you decide is, I'm going to conquer that city.
Mm.
You got to have some serious ambition and maybe even, a little bit of crazy in you to even think that.
Yeah, crazy is a good word for it because we're not just talking about any city here. The sources describe Constantinople as, and I love this phrase, an impregnable fortress. I mean, we're talking massive walls, defenses that were built up and perfected over centuries. It's hard to imagine what would possess someone to even consider attacking a stronghold like that, let alone actually believing they could take it.
Well, what's really interesting is that if you look at the historical records, a lot of the people in Muhammad's own inner circle, his advisors, they told him not to do it. They said, look, it's never been done before. Those walls, those defenses, it's just suicide. But there's something about Sultan Muhammad. He was absolutely convinced he could do it. He even had this saying, and I'm quoting here, fortune favors the bold. It seems like that idea, that belief, was the foundation for everything he did.
So let's get into the details of how he pulled it off. The sources go into some incredible detail about his preparations, and honestly, it's mind-blowing. First of all, the army he put together, we're talking tens of thousands of soldiers, including these elite, highly trained units. I mean, that alone is a massive commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just about the numbers. The Ottoman army at this point, they were known for being really, really good. They had this very well-organized structure, these elite soldiers. They were incredibly loyal, very skilled. But as impressive as all that is, they also had something completely new, something that changed everything about siege warfare.
Oh, you're talking about the secret weapon, right? Those massive cannon. And the sources don't just mention them. They make a point of describing how huge they were. They say their roar echoed across the land. Just think about that for a second. Imagine you're defending that city, and suddenly you hear this sound, like nothing you've ever heard before, this sound of destruction. That alone must have been terrifying. And then, of course, there's the actual damage those things could do to those old walls.
Yeah, these weren't just your run-of-the-mill cannons. The Ottomans had some seriously talented engineers, and they created these, super-sized cannons. I mean, way bigger than anything anyone had ever seen before. The most famous one, I think, was called the Basilica Bombard or something like that. These things were a total game changer. They could launch these huge projectiles, and the traditional fortifications, those walls everyone thought were so strong, well, they were never designed to withstand that kind of firepower.
And it wasn't just brute force either, right? The sources also talk about how strategically brilliant Sultan Muhammad was. He just seemed to always be one step ahead of the defenders, outsmarting them at every turn. Like that chain he had built across the Golden Horn. That was a pretty clever move. I mean,
Yeah.
that was a massive barrier. And it was designed specifically to stop enemy ships from getting in, to reinforce the city.
Right, the Byzantines, they still had a navy. And that chain basically gave them control over who could get in and out of that waterway. They probably thought it made them completely safe from attack on that side. So the big question is, how do you get past something like that? I mean, it's a huge metal chain blocking the entire harbor. What are you going to do?
And this is the crazy part. They literally transported their ships over land. They built this temporary road over the hills, and they dragged their entire fleet into the Golden Horn. They just bypassed the chain entirely. I mean, the logistics of that, the sheer audacity of you thinking of it, is just incredible.
It's one of those things you read about and you just shake your head in amazement. To move that many ships over land, that must have been a monumental effort. It required so much planning, such incredible engineering, and the discipline of those Ottoman soldiers, it's remarkable. Just think about it from the defender's point of view. You think you're safe, you have this huge chain protecting you, and then suddenly, boom, there's an enemy fleet in your harbor. Where did they come from? How is that even possible? I mean, that right there had to be a huge blow to their morale.
So with all these amazing preparations in place, the siege finally began on April 6th, 1453. And for almost 2 months, Constantinople was under constant attack. It must have been relentless.
Yeah, for 8 weeks, they just pounded the city, nonstop bombardment from those cannons, and wave after wave of attacks. But it's important to remember that the Byzantines didn't just give up, you know? They fought back hard.
Right, led by their emperor, Constantine the Other. He's described as a really courageous leader, rallying his troops, the people of the city, to defend their home against this overwhelming force. And they did a pretty good job of it for a while. I mean, they held out for weeks. Were there moments where it seemed like the Ottomans might actually fail?
Oh, absolutely. The first few attacks, they were repelled. The defenses held strong. The Byzantines knew the city well, and they were good fighters. But as the siege dragged on, the situation got worse and worse. Supplies started running low. The constant bombardment, the attacks, it just wore them down. And they couldn't get reinforcements. The Ottomans just had too many men.
And that leads us to the final assault on May 29th, 1453. And the sources describe this incredible increase in the intensity of the cannon fire. And then finally, the moment everyone had been dreading, cracks started appearing in those walls. Walls that had stood for centuries, suddenly they were starting to crumble.
I imagine that was a turning point. I mean, for both sides. For the
Yeah.
Ottomans, it was like, okay, this is it. We're finally breaking through. Those walls, they're not invincible after all. But for the Byzantines, it must have been devastating. Their last line of defense was failing. What do you think was going through their minds at that point? I mean, imagine the fear, the despair in that city.
I can't even imagine. And then, of course, what happened next was inevitable. The Ottomans finally breached the city gates. It was in the afternoon. And the sources just say, very matter-of-factly, Sultan Muhammad entered the city as a conqueror. It's a simple sentence, but it really captures the magnitude of what had just happened. The end of an empire, the beginning of a new era.
Yeah, it's really hard to overstate how significant this event was. The fall of Constantinople, it marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. This was an empire that had existed for over 1,000 years. It was the end of Rome, really. And it sent shockwaves across Europe. The balance of power had shifted. And the Ottomans, well, they were now a major force on the European continent.
And everything changed immediately. Constantinople was no longer a Byzantine city. It became the heart of the Ottoman Empire. They renamed it Istanbul. It was their new capital. That alone shows you how complete the transformation was.
And of course, there's the Hagia Sophia. For centuries, it had been this magnificent cathedral, and they turned it into a mosque. That was a powerful symbol. It showed everyone who was in charge now. And it really represented the rise of Islam in a city that had been Christian for so long.
And this wasn't just a one-off victory for Sultan Muhammad, right? He went on to rule this huge empire that spanned across Europe, Asia, and Africa. This conquest of Constantinople, it was the foundation for all that.
Exactly. Taking Constantinople gave the Ottomans this really important foothold in southeastern Europe. They controlled key trade routes, both on land and at sea. And Sultan Muhammad, from then on, he was known as Fateh, which means the conqueror. And he continued to expand the empire. His reign is considered a golden age for the Ottoman Empire. There was so much territorial expansion, cultural development, and all kinds of reforms.
And when you look back at his story, what really stands out, I think, is his incredible vision, his strategic thinking, and his sheer determination. He set out to do something that everyone thought was impossible, and he did it.
And what do you think the lesson is here for our listeners? What can we take away from this story?
I think it's a reminder that even when things seem impossible, when everyone tells you it can't be done, well, it might be possible. If you have a clear vision, if you're willing to put in the work, if you never give up, you can achieve incredible things. Sultan Muhammad Fateh is proof of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for our listeners, I think the big takeaway here is that a clear vision combined with strategic planning and a refusal to give up can overcome even the most difficult obstacles. I mean, look at Sultan Muhammad Fateh and the conquest of Constantinople. It's a perfect example of how ambition, smart planning, and taking action can actually change the world.
So that wraps up our deep dive into the fall of Constantinople. It's truly epic story, full of ambition, courage, and strategic brilliance. And it really shows you the impact that one person's determination can have.
This event, it really makes you think about something bigger, you know? Throughout history, there have been all these individuals who defied the odds, who achieved the impossible. What do they all have in common? What drives them? What can we learn from their examples about the power of belief and the potential we all have to make a real difference in the world? These are questions worth thinking about long after this deep dive is over.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. See you next time.
Take care.